Rutgers football travels to Virginia Tech on Saturday, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, live on the ACC Network. Huge game for both programs. Rutgers now 2-0, coming off its bye week. First Power 4 matchup of the season. Obviously a rematch from last year when Rutgers defeated the Hokies 35-16 in Piscataway. David Anderson is back to help preview this current matchup. David, wanted to obviously start with Virginia Tech in terms of Kyron Drones. He made his debut last year coming off the bench for Virginia Tech. Looked pretty good and just got better and better as the year went on. Now their unquestioned starter. What are your thoughts on his what he brings to the table for the Hokies, concerns and things to watch for heading into this matchup on Saturday?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the biggest thing with Drones is he probably did last year what we were hoping Gavin Wimsatt would do. And then he seems to have improved even a little bit since then. He's a bigger guy. He can run, but he prefers to stay, let's say, around the pocket. He likes to be in the pocket or slightly outside the pocket. From a throwing standpoint, he's definitely more accurate than Wimsatt. One of the other things that he does well is he can buy himself some time by moving laterally without running, but because he's a strong runner, it can freeze the linebackers or safeties that are watching him, which may allow his receivers to then get open. Subsequently, because of that, he's very comfortable throwing to either guys who are open against zone coverage where everyone's kind of stationary, or throwing the ball to guys who have 2 or 3 steps on their defender. He does hesitate at times to throw the ball if his man is not wide open, and he has less interceptions as a result. But there are ways if you can stay close, he won't even risk those throws. The other thing is that because he wants to throw it against like zone coverage, you can kind of stack the middle, and if you don't give a lot of space, that's basically what Marshall tried to do to them. And Old Dominion tried it, but they just didn't have the athletes to execute. So there are ways to play against him as long as your defensive backs can hold up very deep on the back end, because he throws a much better deep ball than Wimsatt did last year.
Yeah, I think and Rutgers fans always get very nervous when you play a true dual threat quarterback. And Jones obviously has the potential for both. But Virginia Tech has shown more of a preference to throw the ball this year so far. And it's going to be interesting to see how they balance it, how they kind of start their attack in this game. In terms of Drones and the defense, I guess one thing that jumps out in this matchup, too, for Virginia Tech is all the playmakers they have on offense. I think you could argue the Virginia Tech offense has more explosibility than the Rutgers offense. What are your thoughts on that and some key playmakers that you think will be key matchups for the Rutgers defense?
Yeah, I mean, you can see why Virginia Tech is having a little bit of an identity crisis. They have a good running back who has been banged up. Their offensive line has been in a little bit of flux also due to injuries. And then they have all these playmakers. They have really 4, if not more, receivers that could play in a 2 deep for a Big Ten team. They have a tight end who's a brother of one of the receivers, and then they have the running back. So they have these players. The other thing about it is Kyron Drones is right at that height where he's not super short, but he's not super tall. So there was times, especially against Vanderbilt and Marshall, where he couldn't really see and deliver the ball confidently because, like I said, he likes to see his receiver open before he throws the ball, which is something that, I mean, we've seen many Rutgers quarterbacks do over the years, but he has the accuracy to deliver it. So one of the things that they try to do, because he wants to see his guys open, is they did try earlier in the season to spread things out to give him more viewing lanes, especially on the perimeter, because it's a lot tougher for him for a quarterback in, for example, the Soraka system, when there's tight ends or slot receivers on the inside of the field, that if you're not super tall, and I mean the difference between being 6'1" and 6'3", 6'4", it may not be a big deal in certain systems, but it is in others. And I feel like there were times where he had guys wide open, he just didn't see them, or he didn't feel confident that they were open to throw that ball. So they tried to spread it out and get it to these, good, sometimes elite playmakers, but it seemed like it compromised their integrity of their team. Like we talk about Rutgers and Kyle Monungai being the heartbeat. I do think Tootin, the running back, is I don't know if he's the heartbeat, but maybe he's like the pacemaker. He's the guy that they feed off of, especially on the offensive line when he makes a big run. So it'll be interesting to see how Virginia Tech tries to attack the Rutgers defense, but I do think they're going to try to run the ball a lot. I don't think that's going to be their main success against the Rutgers defensive line, which is going to be as stout as Vanderbilt, if not more in the run game. And so it'll be interesting to see how Virginia Tech attacks it. But I mean, I really like their receivers, and I really like the diversity of their skill sets. They got tall guys, they got short guys, they got fast guys, they got good route runners, they got a little bit of everything. And so how Rutgers can contain them in one-on-one battles is going to be something worth watching.
Yeah, those are great points. I think it probably makes sense now to go through some of the injuries. We know, obviously, with Rutgers' availability report, Giannis made it clear we're not going to know until 2 hours before kickoff in terms of who is available for Rutgers. But obviously, hoping Tyreen Powell can play. We'll get into the linebacker situation in a little bit here. Obviously, from a defensive line standpoint, Wesley Bailey, Troy Rainey have yet to play this year, so hoping to see them. Flip Dixon did return for limited duty in that win over Akron. So we'll see who else has maybe recovered. Shiano mentioned a potential couple of injuries after that game, but Virginia Tech also dealing with a lot of injuries right now. Brent Pry actually releases a depth chart, actually releases an injury report. So we actually have a lot of information there. Going back to Tootin, he did get a lower body injury against Marshall 2 weeks ago. He did rush 21 times for 115 yards and 2 touchdowns against Old Dominion, but he is listed as questionable and still dealing with whatever that lower body issue is and has been kind of limited in practice. The wide receiver, Ali Jennings, who was big in 2022, missed all last year, still was limited against Old Dominion after playing a lot in the first 2 games. Their linebacker, Kelly Lawson's questionable, but the offensive line, their left tackle, Xavier Chaplin, left after 2 snaps in that win over Old Dominion. He's listed as questionable. He did practice as of Wednesday, but is limited. Jalen Stroman, starter safety, coming into the season, left in the middle of that Vanderbilt game and hasn't returned, and no timetable for his return. So a lot of key spots, 4 or 5 starters, either out or questionable for this game. Going back to what you were saying in terms of the Virginia Tech offense, with the potential that, their starting left tackle is out. We know Tootin might be limited a little bit. What are your thoughts in terms of how that plays into the Rutgers defense?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I think like a top tier ACC team can compete with Big Ten teams or SEC teams, but lacking depth may be an issue. I mean, when you look at Virginia Tech, their fans complain about the right tackle, who is, up and down. But to me, their left guard spot is really their most vulnerable. The guys that have played there just don't have the lateral agility. So a lot of times when you see plays get blown up, it's because the edge rusher takes the left tackle out on an island, and then that left guard is forced to kind of fend for himself. And they have struggled a lot in that spot. So if their left tackle is now out, which would be a huge thing for Rutgers because he's their best lineman. Everyone says that, and you can watch it for 10 minutes of film and know that that guy is also their best lineman. It's going to be an interesting thing. Do they try to protect those guys? If they try to run to the other side, does Rutgers try to bring extra pressure to that side? The only thing I would say about it, though, is Jones, he's a lot more comfortable rolling to his right side. From his right side, he can throw with a lot more arm angles. Whereas when he rolls out to his left, there was a play against Marshall where he should have had an easy completion and the ball just got batted down, or he kind of has to stop and set his feet or slow down and release the ball. So it gives defensive backs time. Whereas when he's rolling to his right side, he is much more dangerous at just throwing on the run, setting, throwing with more velocity, things like that. So I would expect Virginia Tech, if they're smart, and I do think Rutgers has an advantage in offensive coordinator in this game, if their offensive staff is smart, they will probably do plays, especially if they're on the left hash, where they do try to move the pocket to the right to protect those left side of their line, either due to injury or due to ineffectiveness. But you can't do that all the time. And if Rutgers picks up on this, then obviously they would be able to only defend half of the field. So there are little things that they can do, but I do think Virginia Tech is vulnerable on the left side of their line, especially going to be impactful because Tootin, I think his best skill is when he runs those Cal Monungai, Aaron Young type tosses or almost like a stretch play, and he can kind of pick where he wants to bust the play inside. When he gets 1 or 2 yards where the line is either holding up or pushing the defensive line backwards, Tootin really has an ability to find those creases and cut through. So if Rutgers can kind of hold the point of attack, especially and set the edge, which should be easier against, a weakened left side of the Virginia Tech line, I think it's going to be tough for Virginia Tech to get the running game going. And I think what's going to ultimately happen in this game is they're going to be forced to throw the ball in situations that they did not have success on earlier this year.
Yeah, and I think the left side of that line, too, that just is such an opportunity if Wesley Bailey can play coming off the edge on that right side for the Rutgers defense. But just in terms of, I think it's not rocket science, but if Rutgers can contain Virginia Tech in the run game and really force drones to make plays through the air and make that offense a little bit more one-dimensional, which almost seems like kind of how they've been calling it throughout the last few games in terms of their offensive coordinator, that I think plays into their advantage a lot. You mentioned the secondary being so important. Obviously, Rutgers is one of their strong suits on the defensive end in terms of that. Any other thoughts on the matchup with the Virginia Tech offense versus the Rutgers defense?
I think it's time to just talk briefly about the Rutgers defense and how they can handle this. I think a smart offensive coordinator, if I was the offensive coordinator for Virginia Tech, you know that Rutgers plays strong side, weak side. And you know that Aaron Lewis is the guy you can't let beat you. So if I were the Virginia Tech offensive staff, I would try to get Aaron Lewis on the left side where I feel a little bit more confident in the right side of my offensive line to block him than the other way around. And then by keeping that as a strong side, I would try to force Rutgers to chase plays down from the backside, which means depending on how Rutgers aligns their linebackers, that might be a situation where Daryl Jabomi, if he's on that weak side, again, we don't know how Rutgers is going to align their linebackers if Tyrone Powell is healthy. If Jabomi gets that assignment, he's going to have to chase plays down from the backside because if you give Jones too much time, he can eventually wait for one of his elite playmakers to get a couple steps and deliver the ball accurately. The other thing that Rutgers has to do is they have to hold up in coverage deep. And so whether you decide that you're going to use your corners in sort of like a cover 3, but with your corners, or if you're going to rely heavily on Igbinosun and Loyal as well as Dixon or, Sanders if he's in there to cover these wide receivers deep, they have to hold up. And so if I were Rutgers on the defensive side, I would have to if I were Coach Arseniak or the defensive back coaches, do a good job of ensuring I know which of my defensive backs can cover which of their receivers. Felton's a bigger guy, so maybe Igbinosun could cover him, but maybe you need Loyal to guard some of the smaller, quicker receivers. And so the game that most defenses have tried to play is they've tried to stack the middle with a lot of guys to prevent Jones from getting loose himself or Tootin from getting loose, but then they're risking a deep ball. And if guys are open, Jones can find them. So that's kind of the cat and mouse game Rutgers is going to have to play on the defensive side. Basically what they did last year was they kind of just relied on Dixon to be a rover and him make key decisions about, is he going to, chase the tight end? Is he going to attack the running back? Is he going to be the one who's kind of not spying necessarily drones, but just the one who's most responsible for following his eyes? And so those are a lot of the key decisions that need to be made on the Rutgers defense. But if their left tackle doesn't play, whoever Aaron Lewis is going against, he's going to have to win that one-on-one matchup. The other thing that they're vulnerable to is just pressure up the middle. And so especially whoever is going against that Virginia Tech left guard, like if it's Malcolm Ray or even, a Keshawn Griffin, they have to hold up in the run game. They have to hold their ground and don't let yourself get pushed back. And so that's a lot of what I'm going to be watching for because Rutgers is going to be trying to protect those linebackers. Powell's going to be his first game back or some of the younger, inexperienced guys. And so it's going to be a really interesting cat and mouse game. But again, I do give the advantage in coaching to Rutgers in this matchup.
Yeah, I agree with you. And just talking about the Virginia Tech playmakers in the past game, Jalen Lane, obviously the top receiver for this team, and has averaging 5 catches and almost 70 yards a game. But then also just talking about the injury report, Ali Jennings, he's averaging 30 yards a catch, and he's questionable. Then you have Stephen Gosnell as well. He's got over 100 yards, 150 yards receiving, over 20 yards a catch. So the injury part is interesting, but also how do you think Rutgers is going to approach Lane? Do you think it's going to be multiple, or do you think they're going to Robert Longerbeam, who was on this podcast on Wednesday? Do you think he's going to be the key matchup there, or do you think Rutgers will kind of throw different looks at Lane throughout the game?
I think that Rutgers in the secondary is better served playing how they normally play. And the reason I say that is because Virginia Tech has enough good wide receivers that it doesn't necessarily make sense. It's not like one guy is so much better than the other ones that you should completely adjust your scheme. It's going to be more important to play fast and play physical the way you're used to playing in the backside than adjusting. I think maybe they might make some adjustments on the D-line, but in the coverage units, I would not think so. Because if you try to over commit to one guy, that's where Virginia Tech has a lot of depth. I mean, we saw last year Felton was the one who gave them a lot of trouble, and I don't necessarily think that I wouldn't want to just open yourself up to that, like where you say, okay, Igbenogsen's going to stay with Felton because he's a bigger guy. Somebody else is going to stay with Jennings if he's healthy. I mean, we don't know if he's even going to play. It's hard to say, and if you don't know for sure what the other team's scheme is going to be, it's better to just try to do what you do and do it well, and that's what I think Rutgers is going to do on the back end.
Yeah, very good points. Talking about the Rutgers offense, I think on paper, it's a pretty obvious one. Virginia Tech's defense has struggled mightily against the run, against some inferior competition. They're allowing over 5 yards per carry and 113th in rushing defense in the country, going against Vanderbilt, who, by the way, lost to Georgia State last week. So that loss is looking even worse. And then obviously Marshall and Old Dominion. On paper, obviously Kyle Monangai off to a tremendous start. Being on the road, obviously you have to limit mistakes. What do you think the game plan is going to be? Does this kind of play right into Rutgers' favor in terms of being able to dominate on the ground potentially and really control this game with Kyle Monangai under, running it down the Hokies' throats, so to speak?
Yeah, like you said, a lot of times when we talk about a matchup, you talk about for a major upset to happen, that usually is because the lesser team's strength is the opponent's weakness. Now, in the case of two evenly matched teams, obviously there's a lot more that can go either way. But in this particular case, you're correct that Virginia Tech's weakness is their run defense, and it's pretty easy to see why. Their defensive line is undersized. So what they do, they try to bring a lot of pressure on the outside, and so they don't really want to let you get to the perimeter to have runs, very wide. So what they do is they press their corners up, and then to protect them, they try to have their defensive linemen play a little extra wide, and they're also a little bit undersized. So in a run game, what you need to do is if they just go like I always refer to the Jason Babin wide 9, like if they're way outside, you have to rely on Holland Pierce and Tyler Needham to just funnel them outside and run in between guard and tackle. If they try to slant, because they do a lot of slanting as well, then you need to really tie them up inside and rely on your running back to recognize this and take it to the outside. So what I saw Virginia Tech doing effectively against Marshall and Old Dominion, who are, again, lesser opponents, is they were basically running their defensive tackle, Peebles, the one who's a transfer from Duke. They were kind of relying on him to cover almost 3 gaps in the inside at times. So they were basically forcing these other teams to run up the gut. And so if you're Rutgers, you got to really make sure you control Peebles, because if you can shove him back, even get a double team on him, then you're going to at least be getting 3-4 yards right up the middle before there's even contact. And so Virginia Tech is trying to limit big plays by keeping you in the middle. The old, almost like basketball, Detroit Pistons force Michael Jordan to the middle. Don't let him beat you to the baseline. It's basically the same concept that like they're trying to funnel you to the middle because they know there's more defenders that may be able to make a tackle. But the key that Monangai can bring to this table and why he's so dangerous, and I would be super concerned if I was the Virginia Tech staff, is because the run could start out up the middle, but then he has the vision and knowledge to bounce to the outside, and he's going to be smarter and more experienced than those linebackers who have to react to whatever he's doing. So it's kind of like you want Monangai to get to the outside because they're most vulnerable defensively in that intermediate outside area. But you can't just directly go to the immediate outside area. You need to find a lane or an angle to attack. And Monangai, this is his bread and butter. That's his skill set. And so that's why I feel if I were Virginia Tech, and this is why I think the guest on Richie and Mike's podcast, David Cunningham, I think the reason he picked a Rutgers win was because he is really scared of their biggest weakness being Rutgers' biggest strength.
Yeah, great points. That's the Night Report podcast. We did a crossover episode with them. They do a great job, and that was a really good guess from Virginia Tech. Just looking back at last season's game, Kyle Monangai, 16 carries, 143 yards, 8.9 yards a carry. And speaking about getting to the outside, he had that back-breaking 55-yard touchdown when he did essentially what you just said. He got through that guard tackle and bounced to the outside. And ended that game essentially. Also, Gavin Wimsatt had a very good game on the ground. He had a 34-yard rush in that game. That was a touchdown, and also 87 yards on 11 carries. Rutgers ran for 256 yards and 7.5 yards a carry. On the flip side, they held Virginia Tech to 129 yards rushing. Drones actually had the most. He had 74 yards. He rushed it 22 times in that game. And they held Tootin to just 11 carries for 45 yards. So that's it in a nutshell. You basically want to replicate those results more or less, and you could see Rutgers winning this game despite the home field advantage, despite, and I think in terms of what you said, how much do you think, what are we going to see behind Monangai? Is this a game you just run Monangai 30 times, and especially in that second half, or do you think that Raymond will get some run? Obviously, we don't know Brown's status. If Brown is available, you have to imagine he's going to get some opportunities. But if you don't have Brown available, how much do you lean on Raymond in this type of situation?
I think you got to lean on him a little bit unless you don't trust that he's going to hold on to the ball. Because like we talked about, it's really it does put a defense like on their heels if you bring in a second, even third running back who's got fresh legs. Just to see a guy with and I know Monangai's got good energy. This is not a criticism of him, but I'm just saying as a defense, when you see another running back come in, now this guy's like running straight ahead. If Rutgers can control the point of attack and Raymond can just get those 3-4 yards, that's sometimes almost more demoralizing. I know I've been bouncing all over the place with like other sport comparisons, but like pitchers in baseball will say what kills you is either doubles or singles, and the guy keeps getting to third base, and you just constantly have runners on. Sometimes a home run can allow you to just reset. Yeah. And so I feel like if Raymond is coming in and just pounding up the middle as well, in addition to Monangai, then you go back to Monangai, and he's just now taken to the outside. I mean, I think that's going to be even more demoralizing. And I do think Virginia Tech is a team that does play with a lot of emotion, good and bad. You see their highs are high, but their lows are kind of low. I think Rutgers has the advantage from, being stoic or being even keeled as a team. I know they've only played 2 games and they haven't played superior competition, but Virginia Tech is a very momentum heavy team. You saw that how they played against Old Dominion and Marshall, who are vastly inferior opponents. And they kind of were, having a little swag and when they were doing well, but not as much when they weren't. So I do think it matters. And I do think that you're going to have to play 2 running backs to try to just keep changing what they're looking at. The other thing is because their linebackers are inexperienced, right? You want to throw as many guys as possible so that they're questioning their decision making, or they're not sure, okay, how fast is this guy? What is he going to do? I haven't seen him on tape, and mixing them in as much as possible. I do think this might be a better game for Raymond, but on the flip side, if Rutgers is really controlling the line, like these are linebackers that might have a tough time tackling Sam Brown if he's healthy, because when he gets to the second level and he can get that stiff arm out there on a linebacker who takes a bad angle and can't get to his body, they're going to have a tough time bringing him down, especially their middle linebacker who's a transfer. He's a pretty good player, but he's kind of short. And so if he can't see or you can kind of keep him at arm's length, if you're especially a Sam Brown, then that might be, I think it's Blumfield is his name. Then that might be a matchup to exploit. I mean, their will linebacker has been a revolving door. We have no idea who's going to play at that spot. And so, I mean, I do think, again, a long-winded answer to your question, Raymond, Brown, and Monungai can all bring something to the table, especially if they're rotating them. We haven't even talked about the pass game yet.
Well, so with that being said, you read my mind. It's amazing to realize when you look back at that box score that Rutgers threw for 46 yards in that win against Virginia Tech, scored 35 points. Like I said, 256 on the ground, 46 yards through the air, 7 of 16 once it was that day. Did throw a touchdown to Drimmel. But what do you think in terms of, obviously, Callie Kmanis makes this offense more dynamic. You have Dymere Miller now. You've seen flashes with some of the other receivers. That's going to make it a little bit different in terms of what Virginia Tech has to prepare for. I mentioned at some point after that win over Akron that, that deep ball to Long just puts more on film for Virginia Tech to have to prepare for in a way that's different than last season. How much do you think Rutgers will take chances through the air? How much do they need to establish that pass game early on to be able to set up that run game down the stretch? What do you think that offensive approach is going to look like from Kirk Shiraka?
I would say the most important thing you want to do against Virginia Tech's defense is their safeties play too deep. And this is a very common thing. I mean, another sport analogy, like if you're like a first-time like sweeper in soccer or defender, your natural tendency is to play really, really far back. Same thing in basketball. If you're like back on the press, your natural reaction is to play as far back because you don't know how quick you can get up there. And you feel like I'd rather give up a play in front of me than get beat deep. And so what I saw a lot from Virginia Tech is their safeties played too deep. So what you have to do is, you want to keep them playing too deep. And so if you can beat them downfield, you can try it. Their corners like to press, but they also don't turn their head overly that well. And they also a little bit too physical. So they're prone to potentially get a flag. So I don't know who Rutgers is going to attack with on the deep pass. Maybe it's Long, because like we talked about with Long, he seemed to do a good job in the Akron game of figuring out like to turn his head late and then catch the ball. Because if you look and you make it obvious when the pass is arriving, then their DBs are going to take their hands away or they're going to make a play on the ball. But if they're just looking at you and they're engaged with you, you're going to draw either flags or they won't turn their head and you might be able to make a reception. So maybe Chris Long is that guy. Or maybe Miller can defeat press coverage and get past them. I don't know who Rutgers trusts between maybe Duff or Strong or somebody else who's kind of got that long speed. Because really that long speed deep down the sideline on a fly route is going to work if you have a good receiver who can make that play. But if they don't do that, then what you're going to want to see is you're going to need to see some completions over the middle to just keep those safeties back. Or if then they start to cheat, then maybe you can beat them over the top. So there is definitely some routes that I think Dymere Miller is really good at out of the slot, where it's not like a shallow cross, it's kind of like an intermediate cross, and he should be able to get some separation on those plays. And if he can get the linebackers and safeties backing up, there's going to be tons of running room and more angles for Rutgers to exploit. So those are things that are very important to me. And then the other thing is that Kenny Fletcher, this is a type of situation where they have good speed at defensive end. And so he might be needed to do some of that cross blocking because of his athleticism to face these other athletic guys. Like I can picture a lot of scenarios where maybe they're a little athletic for Tyler Needham. So you want to send Fletcher out to that side, but they kind of are overly aggressive at Virginia Tech. So if he then can leak out, he might be able to run past whoever those second level defenders are in that middle, intermediate area. And so there's a lot of things Rutgers can do. Again, the reason why I would be concerned if I was a Virginia Tech defensive staff is because Rutgers has the weapons to beat my weaknesses. The only thing I'll say additionally to kind of offset that is I think Brent Pry has a very good intuition defensively about what teams are going to try to do. So if he might be on the headset just saying they're going to run it here. And he has a really good defensive sensibility with that. So it's going to be up to Kirk Soraka to ensure that he's not kind of getting too predictable in his play calling, because if he does, that's an area where Virginia Tech does specialize, and their players kind of take on that persona. If you saw, they gave up a big run against Old Dominions because they thought there was a run up the middle coming, and a backup quarterback just ran around the outside, and everyone had funneled to the middle. So if they are too aggressive in their decisions, that can backfire as well. So if you mix up the play calling, it can be quite effective. But I do think Rutgers has the players to do this. But I also think that someone like an Ian Strong is going to have to make a contested catch over the middle at some point to open things up. So a lot of just stuff I just said there, but there's a lot of different ways that Rutgers passing attack can attack this one and really get Virginia Tech on their heels.
Yeah, you said a lot of great points, and I think where you hit the nail on the head. Like for me, this is a Demir Miller statement potential game where I think we can all look at how this goes. This will be a definitive answer to, okay, this Rutgers offense is different this year because Demir Miller gives them another weapon that they haven't had. And I think his ability to also not only in the slot, but just to be able to move him around, do different plays with him. I think he could be a real problem in this game for Virginia Tech. And you mentioned Fletcher as well. I was thinking the same thing. Also as a safety valve, kind of in the middle of the field for Rutgers. Both of those guys have speed that I think are going to be problems for the middle of the field for Virginia Tech. And, I think it's going to be very fascinating for Soraka because, of course, you're going to want to establish a run early. And it's almost going to be tempting. It's going to be hard to not overrun the ball, I think, initially. Because, you plan on being able to dominate. But if you can mix in the right pass plays and be effective and they can get some hits there early on, I think it's just going to set up for a huge second half where Rutgers can just be that Big Ten team that just runs it down their throats because they have to be honest in the defense in terms of the pass game. So I think Callie McManus, obviously, his ability to make some big plays through the air, be efficient in this game. We know they have to be mistake-free, of course, but I think his ability to hit those intermediate routes, and when they do take those deep shots, be able to connect on a couple will do wonders for the offense as a whole. Anything else in terms of the Rutgers offense versus the Virginia Tech defense?
Yeah, I mean, I think like you said, I don't think you want to throw too many passes over the middle because they have a lot of guys there, but you're going to have to get a couple just to keep them guessing. The other thing about Fletcher as a safety valve is when you're playing inexperienced players, and again, this is true of any sport, basketball, soccer, football, they tend to lose discipline the longer a play goes. And so what you'll see a lot of times is that the longer a play goes, a safety or linebacker is going to start to drift. And so if you're in the pass game and you can just be patient, a lot of those plays are going to open up eventually. Now, the one thing you need to do if you're Ethan Callie-McManus is because Virginia Tech relies on speed, especially as their defensive ends, you can't just drop back too far. Like you can't just go backwards. Sometimes you'll see an inexperienced quarterback. They think to buy time, they just got to keep going back. Just like I'm saying, drifting on a defense, they'll start to drift. Same thing with the quarterback. He's got to try to stay in the pocket area and I'm not saying in the pocket per se, but feel, sidestep a rusher, whatever. Because if he just goes too far back, most of Virginia Tech sacks come from their guys just run around the outside. And if you're taking a 9, 10, 11 steps backwards, you're going to have a 10-yard loss, and their guys are going to be faster than Needham and Pierce, no doubt. And so you've got to maintain your composure. Don't drop too far back. But if those plays develop long, then, you might find somebody open. So that's the big thing with their defensive ends. Don't let them just run around you. You got to just make sure that you're maintaining pocket integrity as an offensive line and as a quarterback. So, again, I do agree with you. There's going to be temptation to run the ball too much, and I do think you have to run a lot because late in the game, we could see a situation like Boston College a couple of years ago where even though Rutgers has been mixing it up all game, and I know that was a different offensive staff, but at the end, they just were too big and strong, and Boston College had no chance of stopping them. And I feel like if this game is close late, that could happen again because their defensive line will be worn down and Rutgers can just, crush them. So physically. And so I do think that if it's a close game, even though Rutgers hasn't played in a close game this year, I do give them an advantage there. But you got to just don't let them use their speed against you on either side of the ball. And Rutgers should be in a good position.
Going back to Kyle McManus, just in terms of his experience, he did lead Minnesota to road wins at Nebraska, at Iowa, and at Wisconsin. And in all three games, although Wisconsin game was his best probably of his career, but in all three games, he had 0 interceptions combined. So obviously huge to go on the road. He wasn't even the most accurate in a couple of those games, but he didn't make mistakes, and he did what he had to do just in terms of managing the game. So that's going to be key here. And I think to your greater point, the identity of Rutgers is the key to how they're going to win this game, and that matches up really well with how they can win this game. So I think that that's really encouraging. Did want to touch on special teams real quick.
Yeah.
Virginia Tech has had a punt and a kick blocked in 3 games so far. Obviously, that is another identity piece of this Rutgers team. Haven't seen much of it yet in terms of special teams. They've come close a couple of times. They haven't been bad on special teams. They just haven't fully clicked. I have to imagine the bye week is going to help with that in terms of, having some younger players get used to playing in that type of special team scheme. Certainly an opportunity for this special teams to make a difference on the road. We saw last year how impactful it was for this team, and how prone Virginia Tech appears to be in the special teams in terms of the coverage and giving up blocks.
Yeah, I mean, what you'll notice a lot of times in Virginia Tech is when they're blocking for punt or field goal or extra point, basically, right? Their offensive linemen don't have the lateral mobility. And the same thing on their offense. And so that's where if you can get a situation where you can get a crease, you can shoot that gap. But if you do it, you got to get home, because I think their coverage is not bad, but their coverage downfield, I should say, for example, on punt is pretty good. They're kind of have a tendency to leak out early because they're using these smaller, faster guys. So yeah, I do think it's important for Rutgers to just be very buttoned up with what they're doing. I did think Virginia Tech improved a lot on special teams over the last couple of weeks, but there is an opportunity there where if you bring pressure, that again, same thing on defense. If you want to sell out to try to blitz, you got to get home, but there are opportunities there. But yeah, defensively, on special teams, Rutgers has the advantage, I would say, but Virginia Tech is also kind of boom or bust, just like they are on offense and defense. They might bust a big punt return or a big kick return, or they might get stopped for, loss of yardage or fumble the ball. So there's a lot of kind of boom or bust. And on special teams, I'd much rather be the team that's solid across the board than boom or bust in a game like this. It's possible Rutgers could give up, for example, a big return, because obviously we're dealing with an inexperienced punter. Still, hopefully, like you said, during the bye week, Rutgers is able to practice that a lot, especially with their younger players who we're getting a lot of burn on special teams and get a lot of reps during the bye week compared to some of the more experienced guys. But yeah, I mean, this is a game that if you play poorly on special teams, that's going to give Virginia Tech an opportunity to, especially on short fields, that makes it easier for them to score points. Like, you want to force them to run it for 3 or 4 yards of carry and run a 14-play drive. That's not what they do best. And so if your special teams can avoid a big return or avoid turnovers, like a block punt or something, that should go a long way to winning this game. I would say, like, preseason, I predicted a loss here. After watching Virginia Tech's film a lot, they're very, very vulnerable. You have to just exert your will as a Big Ten team on the lines, and don't let them beat you with like big plays in the kicking game or big passes. And Rutgers should come out of this game with a win. I think if both teams play okay, Rutgers should win. If both teams play their best, though, maybe Virginia Tech has the athletes to get the victory. But I do say it's probably 50-50 on a road game. Virginia Tech's getting a couple points because they're at home. But this is going to be a tough game. I would say if I had to predict it again right now, I think Rutgers is going to win, but it's going to be really tight. Like, this game could go either way, like we talk about a lot. Like a lot of the games this season are going to be.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. So that was perfect what you just said. Going back to special teams, I think more importantly than getting a block is how Anderson, the punter, and Scoggins on kickoffs does. He had a penalty in terms of kicking it out of bounds on one. So I think the kick game for Rutgers, and obviously Patel, whenever he gets an opportunity to kick a field goal, he's been solid so far. All three of them, that to me is the most important part of special teams in terms of they can execute their kicks. I think that will eliminate a lot of potential mistakes and opportunity for Virginia Tech. And yes, we both picked a loss in the preseason for this game. I harped on this game being circled on their schedule. You brought up an interesting point in the beginning of this podcast about how Virginia Tech is an emotional team. So I expect them to be pretty fired up going into this game. Lane Stadium, obviously Blacksburg, known as one of the best home field advantages in college football. It's their white effect game. So I think it's really going to be key for how Rutgers starts this game. Be mistake-free early on. I think that the longer it's close, that is an advantage for Rutgers to, like you said, exert that Big Ten advantage. We've seen Rutgers go 4-0 against former Big East foes that are now in the ACC. And a big reason why is how Rutgers has been able to wear those teams down in the trenches, physically, through the run game, through their defense, through special teams. There's no secret to how Rutgers is going to need to win this game. And I think we talked about some advantages that they have, obviously some concerns. I think, this is a huge test for the Rutgers linebackers in this game, whether Powell plays or not, because, he's not probably – it's going to be his first action in a long time if he does play.
If he does play.
Yeah, but I think obviously you want his experience out there. This is going to be, for the defense as a whole, this is going to be a little bit of a prove-it game, just in terms of can they come together, even with some new pieces, and be as good as we hope they could be in this type of situation. But then also, just in terms of the way it looks right now, honestly, I've definitely changed my tune in terms of how Virginia Tech's looked. I'm not so over the top. Like, there's a lot of stats out there where they'll tell you, Rutgers is the top 5 in the country and this and that. You really can't read too much of it when their strength of schedule is 130th. But I do think there's a lot of positives that we've seen that can only get better for this team. And I think this is a game they should win. If you want to have the year you want to have, this did count as one of my 4 losses in the preseason. I think you predicted the same. Correct?
Correct. I had this as one of their 4 losses. Yeah.
Right. So, it's not the end of the world because also it's not a Big Ten game, but for momentum, for just what we all, the hype of this team, for the, we talked about this team being, even though they are a veteran team, they do have a tendency to use momentum quite a bit. This would be a monster win for them to go on the road and get that win. And I think on paper, they should win this game. I understand they're underdogs, but I think that this is a game that's for the taking for them if they do all the things that they are capable of doing. So it's going to be, I do agree it's going to be close, but I think being close, what Rutgers can't do is make 1 or 2 fatal mistakes in that first 20 minutes of the game and fall behind 2 scores. I'm not saying they can't come back in that game, but if they can keep it close, if they can establish an early lead, that's exactly what Shiano's going to want to do. That's going to play to their strengths as play callers on both sides of the ball. I think Harris Simiak will mix in some wrinkles here and there. And I think Drones is good. I don't think he's elite. And I think that Rutgers has a really good understanding of him and how they maybe will be able to pick out some of his weaknesses. So I think it's a game they should win. We don't have to make a prediction or anything, but I'm picking them to win now. You saying you think they should win, I believe. Any final thoughts on it?
I think it would take Virginia Tech to play their absolute best game to win.
Yeah. I think limit big plays, right? You can't allow 3 or 4 big hits for Virginia Tech. Like you said, you need to make them have those 14, 15 play sustained drives, eat up the clock, but slow the game down. That'll be into Rutgers' advantage. So it's going to be fascinating. I think the discipline of the play calling on both sides, is Virginia Tech going to get antsy and just try to air it out like we've seen a little bit so far? I think that also plays into Rutgers' advantage, especially with the secondary. This is a game that I think the secondary can get multiple takeaways and, obviously would go a long way into winning on the road.
Yeah, I would say you just can't get too predictable early.
Yeah.
You can be predictable late, but can't get too predictable early. You're going to have to complete some passes somewhere. And like you said, you can't make back-breaking penalties. You cannot fumble the ball like deep in your own territory. You can't get a kick blocked. None of those things.
Yep.
You got to force Virginia Tech to go the length of the field because Rutgers is built for that on both sides of the ball. They're not built for the explosive track meet style. So I think, yeah, there's pressure on Cal Manis, but I think the coaches are going to be able to put them in a good position. And I was hoping to make it to the game this week. Doesn't seem like I'm going to be able to, unfortunately. It's a 3-hour drive from Charlotte, give or take. But yeah, I think the big thing to keep in mind, there's always the monkey of getting your first win. There's the monkey of getting your first Power 4 win. And there's a monkey of your first road win. All these things. And so if you can get the monkey off your back for your first Power 4 win, your first underdog and road win, like all in one shot, I think that will take a lot of pressure off of this team going into the next couple games, which are all going to be a dogfight, just like this one.
Totally agree. Last point before we go, which I'll throw it back to you to end it. And thanks so much for being here once again. In terms of this is I'm gonna. People might say I'm gonna jinx you here, but I don't think I've been as confident for Rutgers' offensive line going into a game where I think that they can dominate in this game, especially down the stretch. True or false for you?
True, because they're just so much bigger. Rutgers is so much bigger than the Virginia Tech front. And there's only one guy, I think. I mean, Virginia Tech has a pass rusher who got 4 sacks last week, but he's 250. And he just, like I said, gets most of his sacks running around the outside. So if you can kind of just keep him outside and just even counter punch with a run right there, like that can completely neutralize that part of their game. Mm-hmm. And so, I haven't felt this good about a Rutgers offensive line since at least 2017, maybe even 2014.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say 14. All right, well, there you go. Lots to mull over. Thanks so much for listening and watching once again. David, thanks for being back. I'll have a rapid reaction after the game, and then we'll talk, David and I, next week as well, heading into a short week, hosting Washington, but we'll take it 1 week at a time, and hopefully Rutgers will be 3-0 going into that game, and we'll talk to you then.